In the deep halls of Moria, where once the hammers of the dwarves rang upon anvil and stone, now only darkness dwelt. Yet in this fourth age of Middle-earth, when men had grown complacent in their victory over the shadow, something stirred in the deepest pits, where even the Balrog had not trod. Khazad-dûmul, the last of the 7 rings of the dwarf lords, lay hidden beneath the roots of the Mirror Mere. For 3 ages it had slumbered, its power diminished but not destroyed. And now, as the memory of Sauron faded from the minds of men, the ring began to pulse with malevolent life. From the shadows came Thrakul the Fallen, once a captain of Gondor, now bound to darkness by oaths broken and honor lost. His eyes burned with unholy fire as he descended into the depths, drawn by whispers only he could hear. "Master," he spoke to the emptiness, "your servants have not forgotten. Though your tower has fallen and your ring destroyed, we who served in shadow remember still." The darkness seemed to listen, and in its silence, Thrakul found his purpose renewed. In Isengard, where Saruman's tower once stood proud, the circle of stones remained. Pilgrims came from afar to see where the last of the wizards had made his stand, but none noticed the subtle changes. The grass grew strange and twisted, and at night, shapes moved between the standing stone. Grashuk, greatest of the Uruk-hai, who had survived the War of the Ring, gathered his scattered kin. They came from the misty mountains and the dark places of the world, orcs, goblins, and worse things that had hidden when the shadow fell. "The Master calls," Grashuk snarled to his assembly, "not with voice, but with purpose. The age of men grows weak, and in weakness, opportunity dwells." Meanwhile, in the ruins of Barad-dûr, where no living thing should walk, the mouth of Sauron knelt among the rubble. His helm was cracked, his armor rent, but his malice remained undiminished. In his hands he held a shard of black stone, a fragment of the Dark Tower itself. "Though the ring is unmade and the Master departed, his will remains written in shadow and flame," the mouth whispered. "We shall be his legacy, his final gift to this world." Deep in Moria's heart, Thrakul found what he sought. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness, and at its center lay a pool of water, black as night. Within those depths, Khazad-dûmul gleamed with eldritch light. As his hand closed upon the ring, visions flooded his mind. He saw the forging of the 7, the betrayal of the dwarves, and the long years of corruption. But more than that, he saw Sauron's true plan, hidden even from the wise. The One Ring had been but the first step. Each of the rings of power contained a fragment of the Dark Lord's essence, and though diminished, they could still serve as anchors for his will. Khazad-dûmul pulsed upon his finger, and Thrakul felt power beyond mortal ken flow through him. "I understand now, Master," he breathed. "The War of the Ring was never about victory. It was about planting seeds for this harvest." With the ring upon his hand, Thrakul could speak across the vast distances to others who served the shadow. His voice reached the mouth of Sauron in Mordor, Grashuk in Isengard, and darker servants still. In Minas Tirith, King Elisar ruled wisely, but even he could not see the rot that spread through his kingdom. Thrakul, wearing the guise of a noble lord, walked the white halls and whispered poison in willing ears. Lord Denethor's younger brother, Boromund, had survived the War of the Ring, but carried within him the seeds of his family's pride and desperation. When Thrakul came to him, speaking of Gondor's need for strength, of the weakness that peace brought, Boromund listened. "The Rohirrim grow lazy," Thrakul murmured as they walked upon the Pelennor fields. "The elves depart for the Grey Havens. Soon Gondor will stand alone, and when the next darkness comes, for it always comes, who will defend the realm of men?" Khazad-dûmul's power worked subtly, turning noble hearts toward shadow, not through corruption, but through the perversion of virtue itself. Boromund began to gather loyal men, speaking of the need to preserve Gondor's strength for trials yet to come. In the ruins of Dol Guldur, where the necromancer had once dwelt, the servants of darkness gathered. The fortress was broken, its towers cast down, but the foundations remained. and in those foundations old power lingered. The mouth of Sauron had come from Mordor, bearing his shard of Barad-dûr. Grashuk led a host of orcs from Isengard, and from the north came others. The hill men of Rhudaur, the corsairs who had fled Umbar, and stranger folk from the far reaches of Middle-earth. Thrakul stood before them, Khazad-dûmul gleaming upon his hand, and spoke with authority that none could question. "We are the last testament of our master's will," he declared. "Though his physical form is gone, his purpose remains. The age of men shall not last 1,000 years in peace. We shall see to that." But, as the council met, none noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the broken wall. Radagast the Brown had not departed Middle-earth with the other wizard, and his woodland spies brought him word of this gathering darkness. Radagast sent word by eagle and raven to those who might yet stand against the shadow. In Rivendell, Lord Elrond had delayed his departure for the Grey Haven. In Lothlorien, Lady Galadriel still dwelt in the Meliorn trees, and in the Shire, certain hobbits had not forgotten the burden they once bore. Frodo Baggins, now aged beyond his years by the wound of the Morgul blade and the weight of the ring, felt the stirring of old fears. The hand that had borne Sting to Mount Doom trembled as he read Radagast's message. "It cannot be," he whispered to Sam, who had become mayor of the Shire. "The ring was destroyed. I cast it into the fire myself." "Aye, Mr. Frodo," Sam replied, his jaw set firm. "But there were other rings, weren't there? 7 for the dwarf lords, and who's to say what became of them all?" Meanwhile, in Rohan, Éomer King received troubling reports from his riders. Orcs moved again in the misty mountains, and strange lights had been seen in Fangorn Forest, where the Ents had grown silent and withdrawn. At Helm's Deep, now called Aglarond by the dwarves who had come to dwell there under Gimli's rule, the first blow was struck. Grashuk's host surrounded the ancient fortress in the dark of night, but this was no assault of sword and fire. Instead, they brought with them fragments of the Palantir of Orthanc, shattered but not powerless. Through these seeing stones, the mouth of Sauron projected visions into the minds of the defender, memories of the great battle, but twisted and corrupted. The dwarves saw their kinfolk fleeing in terror, saw Aragorn fallen beneath orc blades, saw the wall breached not by Uruk-hai cunning, but by their own cowardice. Though Gimli himself resisted these false visions, many of his people were overcome by despair. "This is not the way of our enemy of old," Gimli spoke to his captain. "This is war waged upon the spirit itself, more dangerous than any blade." But even as he spoke, he felt doubt creeping into his own heart. Had the Fellowship truly succeeded? Had the ring truly been destroyed? The visions seemed so real, so vivid. In Isengard, where Saruman's power had once grown, the remaining members of the White Council gathered. Gandalf the White had felt the stirring of shadow and returned from the Grey Haven. With him came Elrond and Galadriel, their faces grave with the weight of knowledge. "The last of the dwarf rings has awakened," Galadriel spoke, her voice like silver bells grown mournful. "I feel its power across the leagues, a poisonous star in the darkness." Gandalf leaned heavily upon his staff, and for the first time since his return as the White, he seemed truly aged. "I had hoped that with the One Ring's destruction, the lesser rings would fade into shadow and be forgotten, but Sauron's malice runs deeper than we knew." They spoke of the corruption spreading through Gondor, of the shadows moving in Moria, of the strange reports from every corner of Middle-earth. It seemed that the very victory of the War of the Ring had been turned against them. Peace had made the free peoples complacent, while the servants of darkness had used the long years to plan and prepare. In Minas Tirith, as King Elisar held council with his advisor, the blow came from within. Boromund, corrupted by Thrakul's whispers and the subtle influence of Khazad-dûmul, stood before the throne and spoke words that chilled the heart of every loyal Gondorian present. "My king," he said, his voice carrying the weight of false righteousness, "I have come to believe that our victory in the War of the Ring was incomplete. We destroyed the ring, yes, but we did not destroy the need for strength. for power to protect what we hold dear? Aragorn's eyes narrowed as he recognized the corruption in his subject's word. Speak plainly, Boromund. What is it you propose? That we seek out the remaining rings of power, Boromund declared. That we use them not for conquest, but for the protection of our people. Surely the Valar would understand. We who have suffered so much deserve the means to ensure it never happens again. The king's hand fell to Anduril's hilt, but before he could speak, Thrakul stepped from the shadows where he had been concealed. Khazad-dûmul blazed upon his finger, and his true nature finally revealed. Too late, son of Isildur, he sneered. The seeds have been planted, and the harvest has begun. As battle erupted in the throne room of Minas Tirith, Thrakul spoke words that struck fear into every heart present, for he revealed the truth that even the wise had not suspected. Sauron had not merely made the rings of power as instruments of control, but as vessels for his own essence. Did you think the Dark Lord so simple? Thrakul laughed as his blade met Anduril. The One Ring was indeed the master, but each of the lesser rings contains a fragment of his spirit. Destroy one ring, and the fragments remain. Gather the fragments together. Understanding dawned like a cold sunrise in Aragorn's mind. He sought to make himself immortal, not through the preservation of his physical form, but through the division of his very being. Even now, my brothers gather the remaining ring, Thrakul continued, pressing his attack. 3 of the 7 we have already claimed. The 9 were destroyed with their bearers, but their power flows back to us. And when all are gathered in one place, he did not need to finish. The implication was clear. Sauron's resurrection would be complete. Across Middle-earth, the alarm was raised. Eagles flew with messages to every corner of the continent. The Ents roused themselves from their long slumber, and even the Entwives, long thought lost, returned from the far eastern lands where they had hidden. In the Grey Haven, ships that had been prepared for departure were turned back toward the shore. At Helm's Deep, Gimli and his dwarves broke the siege through cunning and courage, but not before seeing the true extent of their enemy's power. In the Shire, the hobbits took up arms once more. Though they were no longer the innocent folk they had once been, the greatest shock came from Lothlorien, where Galadriel made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the depths of her realm, she found evidence that one of the 3 elven rings had not departed with its bearer. Vilya, the mightiest of the 3, had been secretly hidden by Elrond before his departure to the Grey Haven. He knew. She whispered to Gandalf as they stood before the hidden vault. Somehow, Lord Elrond foresaw this day and made preparation for it. With Vilya in their possession, the Free Peoples had a weapon that could stand against the collected power of the 7. But using it would mean risking the same corruption that had claimed the ring's other bearer. The final battle was not fought with sword and spear, but with will and wisdom. At Mount Doom, where the One Ring had met its end, the forces of light and darkness gathered for the last time. Thrakul stood upon the very precipice where Gollum had fallen. The 7 recovered dwarf rings arrayed before him in a circle of power. As he began the ritual that would reunite the scattered fragments of Sauron's essence, reality itself seemed to bend around him. But Frodo Baggins, bearing Sting, and accompanied by faithful Sam, had made the journey one final time. And with them came an unexpected ally, Gollum himself, preserved by the power of the ring beyond natural death, had crawled from the fires below. "My precious," the wretched creature hissed, but this time his obsession served a greater purpose. For only one who had borne the ring could truly understand its power, and only one who had been consumed by it could resist the call of the lesser ring. In the end, it was not strength of arms that won the day, but the sacrifice of those who had already given everything. Gollum threw himself upon the circle of rings, and as his body was consumed by their power, he spoke a single word of command that he had learned in the dark places beneath the earth. The rings shattered, their fragments scattering like stars into the darkness. Thrakul's scream of rage echoed across Middle-earth as the last hope of Sauron's return was extinguished forever. But the victory came at a cost. The age of magic was truly ended now, and those who had wielded power for good or ill found themselves diminished. Even Gandalf the White felt the change and knew that his time in Middle-earth was finally at its end. As the sun rose over Mount Doom, painting the ash-covered slopes in gold and crimson, a new age began, an age where the strength of mortals alone would determine the fate of the world. And in the Shire, in a hole in the ground that was not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, but a hobbit hole, and that meant comfort. Life went on. For some tales must end so that others may begin. And in the turning of the season, hope eternal springs anew. Thus ends the tale of how Sauron's servants walked once more in Middle-earth, and how they were at last defeated, not by the might of kings or the wisdom of wizards, but by the courage of the small and the power of sacrifice freely given. Epilogue: the dawn of the Fifth Age, the passing of power. In the years that followed the final destruction of the Seven Rings, Middle-earth underwent a transformation more profound than any in the long annals of its history. The breaking of Khazad-dûmil and its sister rings had not merely ended Sauron's last grasp upon the world, it had severed the final threads that bound the Elder Days to the present, ushering in what the lore masters would come to call the Fifth Age, the Age of Mortal Dominion. Gandalf the White stood upon the Grey Haven's pier for the last time, his staff no longer blazing with the inner fire that had marked him as one of the Astari. The salt wind carried with it the scent of distant shores and the promise of rest, long denied. Beside him, Galadriel and Elrond waited in silence, their own powers diminished, but their wisdom undiminished. "It is finished," the wizard spoke, his voice carrying neither triumph nor sorrow, but acceptance. The last echo of the music of creation has faded from these shores. What remains is for mortals to shape according to their own will and wisdom. Galadriel nodded, her silver hair catching the first light of dawn. Long have we guided and guarded the peoples of Middle-earth, perhaps too long. In protecting them from darkness, we may have also shielded them from the full measure of their own potential. From the harbor town came the sound of awakening, merchants preparing their wares, children playing in the streets, the ordinary bustle of mortal life continuing its eternal dance. It was a sound more beautiful than any elven song, for it spoke of hope and continuity, of life persisting despite all the darkness that had threatened to extinguish. The stewardship of men in Minas Tirith, King Elisar stood upon the citadel's highest tower, watching the sun rise over his kingdom. The white stone of the city gleamed like pearl in the morning light, but it was not the same Minas Tirith that had stood before the War of the Ring. The scars of recent battle had been mended, but more importantly, the very spirit of the city had been renewed. Gone were the days when Gondor could rely upon the wisdom of the Eldar or the power of the Astari. The betrayal of Boromund had taught harsh lessons about the corruption that could fester in the hearts of even noble men when they sought power, however well-intentioned their goals might seem. But from those lessons had come a new understanding of governance and responsibility. Aragorn had established the Circle of Stewards, not the hereditary office that Denethor's line had held, but a council drawn from all corners of his kingdom, from the humblest farmer to the most learned scholar. Each member served for 7 years before returning to their former life, ensuring that power remained a burden shared rather than a privilege hoarded. "My lord," came a voice from behind him. Faramir, now bearing the title of Prince of Ithilien, approached with a scroll in his hand. The years since the War of the Ring had been kind to Denethor's younger son. The shadow of his father's madness had been lifted, and in its place had grown a wisdom tempered by loss and refined by responsibility. "Word from Rohan," Faramir continued, offering the scroll. "King Éomer reports that the last of the orc bands has been driven from the Misty Mountain. His riders found their stronghold empty. They had simply departed, vanished into the wild lands beyond the Sea of Rune." Aragorn took the scroll, but did not immediately read it. Instead, he gazed eastward, toward the lands that lay beyond the borders of his realm. "They flee not from our sword, but from the changing of the world itself, the power that created them, that bound them to darkness and malice. is gone. What becomes of such creatures when the evil that shaped them is no more? It was a question that had troubled him since the final battle at Mount Doom. The orcs, goblins, and other fell creatures had not simply died when Sauron's last influence was broken. Instead, many had begun to change, their native malice fading like a disease cured. Some had even approached the borders of the civilized lands, not as raiders, but as refugees, seeking meaning in a world where their original purpose no longer existed. Perhaps, Faramir suggested quietly, they seek what we all seek. A place where they might belong. A purpose that brings something other than destruction. The king's hand fell to Andúril's hilt, a gesture that had become unconscious over the years of his reign. But the sword remained sheathed, for these were problems that could not be solved with blade or bow. They required something far more difficult: understanding, patience, and the courage to extend mercy, even to former enemies. The Shire remembered. In Bag End, Frodo Baggins sat in his study, pen poised over parchment as he struggled to find the words for what might be his final chapter. The red book lay open before him, its pages filled with the tales of the Hobbit and the Lord of the Ring. But now he sought to add one more story, the tale of Sauron's final defeat and the price that victory had demanded. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, not from age alone, but from the weight of memory. The destruction of the Seven Rings had lifted a burden from his spirit that he had carried unknowingly for years. The shadow of the One Ring, which had never entirely left him despite its destruction, had finally passed completely away. Yet with that relief had come a profound sadness, for he understood now that his part in the great tale of Middle-earth was truly finished. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Sam Gamgee entered, bearing a tea service and wearing the simple clothes of a gardener, rather than the regalia of his office as mayor of the Shire. Between the two friends, such formalities had long since been set aside. "How goes the writing, Mr. Frodo?" Sam asked, setting the tea tray upon a side table with the careful precision that marked all his actions. "Slowly," Frodo admitted, setting down his pen and accepting the offered cup with grateful hands. How does one capture the end of an age in mere words? How can ink and parchment convey the feeling of standing at Mount Doom while reality itself bent and twisted around us? Sam settled into the chair beside the window, the same chair he had occupied during countless conversations over the years since their return to the Shire. His face, weathered by years of honest labor, but brightened by contentment, bore the wisdom of one who had seen the world's end and its renewal. "Maybe that's not what needs capturing," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe what matters isn't the grand doings and the magic and such. Maybe what matters is that when it was all over, folk could still plant gardens and raise children and sit by their fires of an evening, knowing they were safe." Frodo smiled, the first genuine smile that had crossed his features in many days. "Ever the philosopher, Sam, and ever right, I suspect." From the window came the sound of children playing in the lane outside Bag End, their laughter bright and careless in the afternoon air. It was the sound of a future untroubled by the shadows of the past, and in that laughter lay the true victory of all their struggles, the legacy of Gimli. In the glittering caves of Aglarond, Gimli, son of Glóin, stood before the greatest work of his long life, a hall carved from living stone that surpassed even the greatest achievements of Khazad-dûm in its prime. The caverns had been transformed into a wonder that would have made the kings of the Lonely Mountain weep with envy. But this was not Gimli's greatest accomplishment. Around him worked dwarves and men side by side, their tools ringing in harmony as they shaped the living rock. But these were not merely craftsmen and laborers. They were the first students of the Academy of Stone, the school that Gimli had established to preserve and share the ancient knowledge of his people. For too long, the dwarves had hoarded their secret, allowing the great works of their ancestors to crumble into legend. But the events of the War of the Ring and its aftermath had taught Gimli that knowledge shared was knowledge preserved. When he passed into the halls of his fathers, the skills of stonemason and metalsmith, of tunnel wright and treasure seeker would not die with him. "Master Gimli," called a young voice. and the dwarf turned to see Peregrine took approaching, though the hobbit was young no longer. Years of leadership in the Shire and service as one of Aragorn's counselors had added both gravity and wisdom to Pippin's feature, though his eyes still held the spark of mischief that had marked him since youth. Peregrine took, Gimli rumbled, his voice echoing pleasantly in the carved hall. What brings the Tane of the Shire to my dusty caverns? Surely not a desire to learn the proper way to set a foundation stone? Pippin grinned, but his expression quickly grew serious. I bring word from Merry in Rohan. The Ents have begun to stir again, not to war, but to something else. They speak of a great planting, of seeds that will grow into forests, the like of which have not been seen since the elder days. The dwarf's eyes widened slightly. Relations between his people and the Ents had always been strained. Dwarves shaped stone and metal, while the tree shepherds nurtured growing things. But the mutual respect that had developed during the War of the Ring had never entirely faded. "And what does this have to do with an old dwarf and his stone halls?" Gimli asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "They ask for your counsel," Pippin replied. "It seems they wish to create not just forests, but forest cities, places where the growing wood and the carved stone might exist in harmony. They remember that you alone among the dwarves learn to see the beauty in growing things." Gimli was quiet for a long moment, his gnarled hands tracing the smooth surface of a pillar he had carved with intricate designs of leaf and flower, patterns no dwarf before him would have thought to include in their work. The influence of his unlikely friendship with Legolas had changed more than just his appreciation for forest beauty. It had opened his mind to possibilities that his ancestors could never have imagined. "Tell the Ents," he said finally, "that Gimli, son of Glóin, would be honored to lend his knowledge to their great work. But in return, I ask that they send teachers to Aglarond. My people have much to learn about the harmony between shaped and grown things." Be the wandering of Legolas. Far to the south, where the white beaches of Belfalis met the endless expanse of the great sea, Legolas stood alone upon the shore. The salt wind stirred his golden hair, and his eyes, those eyes that had seen the passing of ages, gazed westward toward the distant shores of Valinor. For years after the War of the Ring, he had labored alongside Gimli in the caves of Aglarond, finding unexpected beauty in the halls of stone. But the call of the sea, once heard, could not be silenced, and eventually, even the strongest friendship could not compete with the longing that sang in his immortal heart. Yet he did not depart immediately for the Grey Haven and the ships that waited there. Instead, he had spent the last months of his time in Middle-earth, walking its length and breadth, saying farewell not only to places but to the very concept of places. For once he sailed west, the mortal lands would become memory, as distant and unchanging as a song half-remembered from childhood. Behind him, the sound of approaching footsteps caused him to turn. A figure emerged from the dune, tall and lean, cloaked in the manner of the ranger, but bearing himself with a dignity that spoke of noble blood. As the stranger drew nearer, Legolas recognized him as one of the Dúnedain, though not one he had met before. "Lord Legolas," the ranger said, offering a respectful bow, "I am Telchar, son of Targon, and I bear a message from King Elisar." The elf nodded graciously, though his expression remained distant. "Speak your words, Ranger of Gondor." Telchar drew forth a scroll sealed with the white tree of Gondor. "The king bids me say that while he understands your choice to depart these shores, he would consider it a great service if you would carry with you the memory of what Middle-earth has become, not merely what it was. He asks that when you reach the Undying Lands, you speak to the valor of the Fourth Age that is ending, and the Fifth Age that has begun, of mortal kingdom that have learned wisdom through suffering, and of the hope that dwells yet in the hearts of men." Legolas took the scroll and broke the seal, reading quickly through Aragorn's formal words. But beneath the ceremonial language, he could sense the deeper message, a request that he serve as witness and advocate for a Middle-earth that had grown beyond the need for elvish guidance, but still deserved elvish respect. "Tell your king," Legolas said, rolling the parchment carefully and placing it within his traveling pack, "that I will bear his words to the western shore, and that the memory of mortal courage will shine no less brightly in the halls of Valinor than the light of the two trees themselves." As the ranger departed, Legolas remained upon the beach until the stars emerged in the darkening sky. In their light, he composed the final verses of a song that had been growing in his heart for months, a lament not for the passing of the elder days, but a celebration of what would come after. The burden of victory. In the great library of Minas Tirith, Faramir worked late into the night, surrounded by scrolls and books that chronicled the new age that was beginning. As Prince of Ithilien and Chief Counselor to the King, he had taken upon himself the task of recording not merely the events of recent years, but their meaning, the lessons that future generations would need to understand if they were to avoid the mistakes of the past. The candle beside his writing desk flickered in a draught from the open window, casting dancing shadows across the page where he had been writing. The greatest danger in victory is the belief that victory alone is sufficient. We have learned, to our cost, that the defeat of an enemy does not automatically ensure the triumph of goodness. Darkness can arise from within as easily as from without, and perhaps more dangerous, for internal corruption wears the mask of virtue and speaks in the language of noble purpose. He paused in his writing, remembering the expression on Boromoon's face when the man had advocated for seeking out the remaining rings of power. There had been no evil intent in that suggestion, no conscious desire to repeat Sauron's mistakes. Instead, there had been only the earnest belief that power could be wielded safely by the righteous, that good intentions could somehow purify corrupted tools. It was a seductive belief, and one that Faramir himself might have embraced had he not experienced firsthand the subtle influence of the One Ring during the War of the Ring. The memory of that encounter, brief though it had been, served as a constant reminder of how easily good men could be turned aside from their path. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Elwyn entered, bearing a steaming cup of tea and wearing the simple dress of a healer rather than the armor she had once donned to face the Witch King. Marriage had brought peace to the Shield Maiden of Rohan, but it had not dimmed the steel in her spirit. "Still writing?" she asked, setting the cup beside his elbow and glancing at the manuscript that covered his desk. "Will future generations truly need to know every detail of how we nearly repeated the mistakes of the past?" Faramir set down his pen and took her hand in his, noting the small scars that marked her fingers, not from sword work, but from the thorns of the healing plants she tended in her garden. "Especially the detail," he said softly. "History has a way of smoothing over the rough edges, of making heroes seem more heroic and villains more villainous than they actually were. But the truth is more complex and more dangerous. Heroes can fall, and even villains once believed themselves to be doing good." Éowyn nodded, understanding. Her own journey from despair to hope had taught her how thin the line could be between noble purpose and destructive obsession. "Then write it all," she said. "Write it truly, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be." The new fellowship in Edoras, the Golden Hall of Meduseld, rang with laughter and song, but it was laughter and song of a different character than had been heard in the days of Theoden King. Éomer had proven to be a ruler of different temperament than his uncle. Where Theoden had been stately and formal, Éomer brought the rough camaraderie of the cavalry to his court. Around the great table sat an unlikely collection of guests: Meriadoc Brandybuck, Master of Buckland and Knight of Rohan; Peregrine Took, Thane of the Shire, and Guard of the Citadel; several of Éomer's most trusted Eord leaders, and a handful of figures who would have been unthinkable as guests in any previous age. Among these last was Gosh Ugg, once an orc captain in the service of Saruman, now calling himself simply Ash, and serving as an interpreter and guide for the increasing number of former servants of darkness who sought to make new lives in the changing world. The transformation was not merely cosmetic. The malice that had once burned in his red eyes had been replaced by something approaching wisdom, though he would never be mistaken for anything other than what he had once been. The reports from the Misty Mountains continue to be encouraging, Éomer was saying, his voice carrying easily through the hall. The Dunlendings have agreed to the boundary markers we proposed, and there have been no raids for 3 full seasons. Merry nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. It's not just the absence of war that matters, he said. It's what grows in war's place. Trade, friendship, the slow work of building trust between peoples who have spent generations as enemies. Aye, rumbled one of the Eord leaders, a grizzled veteran named Elfhelm, but trust must be earned on both sides. Some of my riders still sleep with swords close to hand, and I cannot blame them for their caution. Ash spoke up, his voice rough but carefully controlled. Caution is wisdom, but fear breeds only more fear. Those of my former kin who seek new purpose, they know they must prove themselves with deeds, not words, but they need the chance to do so. It was a delicate balance, this new world they were all helping to create. The scars of centuries of warfare could not be healed in a single generation, but the work had begun. Former enemies were learning to work together, not out of any mystical transformation of their natures, but out of practical necessity and slowly growing mutual respect. Pippin raised his cup, which contained not the ale of his youth, but a lighter drink more suited to his position as a diplomatic representative. To the hardest victory of all, he said, the victory over our own hatred and fear. The toast was drunk solemnly, for all present understood how much easier it would have been to continue the old patterns of conflict and revenge. The choice to build something new required a kind of courage that was different from battlefield heroism. The courage to be vulnerable, to risk betrayal, to believe that people could change even when all their history suggested otherwise. The Gardens of Memory. In Ithilien, where Faramir had established his principality, the great work of restoration continued. The gardens and groves that had once been the fairest province of Gondor were slowly being reclaimed from the shadow that had lain upon them for so many years. But this was not merely a return to what had been before. It was the creation of something entirely new. Working alongside the men of Gondor were refugees from across Middle-earth, elves who had chosen not to sail west, dwarves who had emerged from their mountain halls, even some of the Ents who had grown weary of their long isolation. Together, they were creating gardens that celebrated not the dominance of any single people, but the harmony that could exist when different forms of life worked in concert. In the center of the greatest garden stood a monument, unlike any other in Middle-earth. It was not a statue of kings or heroes, but a simple stone inscribed with all the names of those who had fallen in the War of the Ring, from the mightiest lord to the humblest foot soldier, from the men of Gondor to the orcs of Mordor. For in death, Faramir had decreed all were equal, and all deserved to be remembered. The inscription at the monument's base read simply, "They died so that others might choose to live differently." It was a controversial memorial. Many had argued that the servants of darkness deserved no remembrance alongside the heroes of the light. But Faramir had held firm in his conviction that the new age required a new understanding of memory and forgiveness. We honor not their choices, he had explained to those who objected, but their potential, the potential that existed in every thinking being to choose differently than they did. By remembering them, we remember that we too might choose wrongly, and thus we guard ourselves against the pride that leads to downfall. The final departure. At the Grey Havens, the last ship of the Elder Days prepared for departure. Upon its deck stood figures of legend. Gandalf the White, no longer bearing his staff of power, but carrying instead a simple walking stick. Galadriel and Elrond, their faces serene with the knowledge of home at last within reach. And Legolas, his sea longing finally to be fulfilled. But they did not sail alone. With them came Frodo Baggins, ring-bearer and hero of the Shire, whose spiritual wounds would find healing only in the undying lands. Beside him stood Sam Gamgee, who had chosen to accompany his dearest friend on this final journey, leaving behind his beloved Shire, but carrying with him the seeds of malorn trees that would someday grow in gardens beyond the circles of the world. On the dock, those who remained gathered to bid farewell. Aragorn and Arwen, their faces marked by the weight of kingship, but bright with the hope of the future they would build. Gimli, who wept openly for the departure of his friend, but who carried in his heart the gift of seeing beauty in all its forms. Merry and Pippin, now leaders of their people, but forever bonded by the fellowship they had shared. As the ship began to move away from the dock, Gandalf raised his hand in a final blessing, but he spoke no words of power, cast no spells of protection, for the age of such things was ending, and what remained was for mortals to shape according to their own will and wisdom. The ship sailed west into the setting sun, carrying with it the last remnants of the elder days. As it disappeared beyond the horizon, those who remained felt both loss and liberation. Loss for the passing of wonder and magic, but liberation from the burden of looking always to others for guidance and salvation. The dawn of tomorrow years passed, and the new age took shape gradually, like a sculpture emerging from rough stone. The kingdoms of men grew in wisdom and strength, learning to govern themselves without the guidance of the wise. Trade routes opened between former enemies, and the great roads of Gondor and Rohan carried not armies, but merchants and scholars, pilgrims and wanderers. In the Shire, a new generation of hobbits grew up hearing tales of the great adventure, but living lives of peaceful prosperity. The Red Book of Westmarch was copied and shared, but it became not a manual for heroic action, but a reminder of the price of complacency and the value of simple courage. The dwarves emerged from their mountain halls in greater numbers, sharing their knowledge and skills with the world above. The Academy of Stones became a place of pilgrimage for craftsmen from every corner of Middle-earth, and the techniques developed there led to architectural marvels that surpassed even the great works of the past. In Fangorn Forest, the great planting that the Ents had envisioned took root. New forests sprang up across Middle-earth, but these were not the wild woods of the Elder Days. They were planned communities where trees and buildings existed in harmony, where the wisdom of growing things was balanced with the needs of settled folk. The former servants of darkness found their own paths in this new world. Some, like Ash, became bridges between the old hatred and the new understanding. Others retreated to the far corners of the earth, seeking solitude while they struggled to understand what they were meant to be in a world no longer divided between absolute good and evil. A few proved unable to adapt and faded away, becoming legends themselves, not of evil, but of the tragedy of beings unable to grow beyond their original purpose. The Testament, in the great library of Minas Tirith, now expanded to rival even the archives of Rivendell. The scribes worked to preserve the wisdom of the ages, but alongside the ancient lore, they recorded new discoveries, new philosophy, new ways of understanding the relationship between power and responsibility. Chief among these new works was the Testament of the Fourth Age, a collaboration between all the surviving members of the Fellowship and their allies. It was not a history in the traditional sense, but a meditation on the nature of heroism, the burden of power, and the possibility of redemption. One passage, written by Sam Gamgee in his simple but profound style, became particularly famous. I've learned that the hardest battles aren't fought with swords or magic, but with the choice to be kind when kindness isn't easy, to be brave when being scared would be simpler, and to hope when everything around you says hope is foolish. That's the real magic, not the flashy sort that wizards do, but the quiet sort that ordinary folk manage every day just by choosing to be better than they were yesterday. The eternal return, and so the Fourth Age passed into the Fifth, and the Fifth would someday pass into the Sixth, and the great wheel of time would continue to turn. The names of heroes would fade into legend, and legends would fade into myth, and myths would be forgotten and remembered anew. But in the end, that was as it should be. For the greatest victory of the War of the Ring was not the defeat of Sauron or the destruction of the Rings of Power. It was the establishment of the principle that each generation must choose anew what kind of world they will create, that power must always be held lightly and passed on willingly, and that the smallest act of kindness can be more significant than the mightiest deed of arm. In a garden in Ithilien, where the sun shone bright through leaves of malorn trees grown from seeds brought back from Lothlorien, children played among flowers that bloomed in colors never seen in the elder days. Their laughter echoed across the hills, carrying with it the promise that life would continue, that growth and change were possible, and that even in a world without magic, wonder could still be found in the simple fact of existence itself. The Fourth Age was ended, and the Fifth Age had begun. And in the turning of the seasons and the passage of years, the great story of Middle-earth continued, not as a tale of predetermined destiny, but as an ongoing choice made new each day by every being who chose to live, to hope, and to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Thus began the age when mortals would shape their own fate, guided not by the wisdom of immortal guardians, but by the hard-won understanding that comes from making mistakes and learning from them. It was a more dangerous age, perhaps, but also a more hopeful one. For it was an age in which every ending could become a new beginning, and every choice carried within it the seeds of transformation. The dawn of the Fifth Age had come at last, and with it, the promise that the story would never truly end. It would only change, as all living things must change, growing ever toward the light.